Hello everyone and welcome to this new class where we are going to talk about the anatomy of the type. By this, I mean all those parts that make up typography. We will talk about reference lines, parts of the letter, the components of the font, characteristics of the letter, styles and family, and the spacing, tracking, and kerning. Let's start, therefore, with the reference lines in a typography. The first reference line is called the baseline. It's this black horizontal line, which we could say is the line where the typography rests. If we zoom in a bit, we will see how that horizontal baseline is sometimes exceeded by some of the letters, mainly the curved letters, to maintain a better harmony between the form and the counterform of that particular letter. The next reference line we need to consider is the X height. The X height refers to the height between the baseline and the highest part of any of the letters that ends in a way horizontal. For example, the letter X, both at its bottom and top, ends horizontally, but it could also be the letter I or the letter V, for example, in this typeface. In any case, the standard is to call it the X height. This X height, which is essentially a vertical dimension, is what determines the body of the typography. When we talk about a typeface at 12 points, 13 points, or 20 points, we are talking about the X height. The next reference line is what are known as ascenders and descenders. As you can already imagine, they refer to those stems or those parts of the letters that go beyond the X height, and then we will call them ascenders, or on the contrary, exceed the baseline downward, and then we will call them descenders. Here on the screen, we see how, for example, the letter B, its stem, surpasses the X height and then becomes an ascender. The G, on the other hand, part of the letter, goes below the baseline, and then we would be talking about a descender. And so on with the F or with the J. It is important that we understand the relationship established between the X height and the ascenders and descenders, because this relationship will determine the effect typography will have on the reader. That is, we do not only have to focus on the X height to define a typeface, we have to see how that X height relates to its ascenders and descenders. Here, for example, we see three cases. The Antico lift, which has a very large X height and very small ascenders. Then we see the case of Helvetica, where the X height is lower and the ascender remains the same as in Antico leaf. And then the effect on reading is completely different. And then we have the Futura, where both the X height and the ascender are reduced, but the difference between one and the other is even more pronounced. That is, there is a greater vertical contrast that flame. To give us a general idea, we could summarize by saying that a high X height with short ascenders or descenders produces more readability in small sizes, a sense of modernity, solidity, and less vertical contrast. On the other hand, a low X height like Futura with longer ascenders and descenders will produce elegance, sophistication, and a more pronounced visual rhythm, but it may be less legible at small sizes. The next reference line we are going to talk about is the so-called high box, and it's that the capital letters in this case are marked here in the image with the letter H. We see it has a slightly lower height than the height of the ascenders. This usually happens with capital heights, and the reason is to differentiate some letters. This way we create a distinction. It doesn't always happen. Not all fonts work this way. Summarizing the reference lines we've seen, we would first have the baseline, the line where the typography rests. Next, we talked about the X height, which is the vertical dimension from the baseline to the top horizontal part of the letter X, which is the reference and marks the size of the typeface body. Then we have ascenders and descenders, which are that part of the letter that goes above the X height or below the baseline. And then we have that peculiarity in capital letters, whose height can be slightly lower than the ascenders to somehow differentiate from other similar letters. Well, the next part of the anatomy of the typeface we are going to discuss is the parts of the letter. The first thing we need to consider is that a letter has a shape which is determined by the ink of that letter. and a counter shape, which is, let's say, the negative space, the white space, in this case colored in blue, that will generate that shape of the letter. The harmony between that form and that counterform in each letter is important, as it is in larger blocks of text, such as this word might be. Here we have the form with its black shape, and here we have the counterform, that negative in blue. When designing typefaces, this harmony is taken into account, both in the letters themselves and in the spacing between them. Let's now move on to the parts of the letter themselves. We will take a serif font as an example, since it's easier to mark the different parts, and we begin by looking on screen at what we know as serifs. Serifs, on a technical level, are those parts of the typography that serve as horizontal bases, where each letter rests on the baseline and act as finishing strokes, as foundations, as I said, and on a geometric level, they function horizontally, mainly. This also happens at the top part of the letters. As we know, it is an inheritance from calligraphic writing, where the ink left traces at the ends of the letters. The serifs can be of many types: thinner, thicker, more wavy, more sinuous, less, and even more marked and rectangular, as in the case of slabs. The next part of the letter we can distinguish is called the drops. Drops are characterized by having a wavy character and will come a bit to balance the weight of the lower part of the letter. Drops can also be of many types: more circular, a bit more geometric, more calligraphic, less. Next, we can talk about the endings. The endings are very similar to serifs, but they have an oblique character, not horizontal. If before we marked the serifs in the H, in the X, or in the V, now we see those endings with that oblique character in the tail of the A, in the M, in the stem of the B, in the U, in the R, etc., etc. Once again, these finishes can be done in many ways. Here we see a few examples. Now we would talk about the connections. Connections relate to elements of the letters through which we would link to the next letter. In this word, we can see it in the E and we can see it in the T. Again, the morphology of the connections can be very varied, and here I show you some examples. Let's now talk about stems. The stems, marked in black, relate to the strictly vertical part of the letter. The moment that stem changes direction, we are no longer talking about a stem, but rather another part of the letter, such as the shoulder or the arc. This shoulder or arc will connect different parts of the letter, usually starting from the stem to reach the dot in the case of the letter A, or connecting the different stems in the case of the letters M, U, or N. The belly, on the other hand, will be that curved element used in semicircular letters. For example, in the A or the B, it will never close upon itself and will lean on the stems. And finally, we have the I. When we talk about the I of a letter, we are referring to the counterform that is created inside an already closed geometry. In summary, the parts of the letter we have seen are the serif, which is defined as the horizontal ending of a letter, the dots, which have a wavy character and are generally used as a counterbalance in semi-hanging elements of the letter. The terminals, very similar to serifs, but with a more oblique nature. The joins, which are defined as those elements with which we would connect to the next letter. The stems, all those strictly vertical parts of each letter. The shoulders, as curved elements that generally unite the different stems of the same letter. The bowls, curved but not closed elements that define semicircular shapes in the letters, and the counters, where we are talking about closed counterforms within a letter. Alright, let's now move on to talk about the components of the font. In a font or typeface, we have the uppercase, the so-called small capitals, and lowercase. If you remember, we saw how this name of uppercase and lowercase came from those first printing presses back in the 15th century with Gutenberg, and how the lead types were positioned in upper boxes within the typesetting table. The small caps, on the other hand, are typographic elements characterized by having the shape of capitals, the shape of uppercase, but the height of X is the lowercase height. They are mainly used to create a kind of subtle emphasis, as they maintain a more uniform visual texture than full capitals. In this way, we are going to use them for acronyms or abbreviations, in continuous texts, in proper names, in titles or subtitles, or design elements where something is to be highlighted without resorting to full capitals. We also need to understand that small caps are specifically designed as a distinct set within type families. It's not always a scale reduction. Other components of the font will be numerals, and in some fonts we can find old-style numerals that will play with that X height, reaching up to the height of ascenders or descenders, and in this way we create a kind of visual play within typography. Other components would be punctuation marks and other symbols or glyphs. Here we see some of them: quotation marks, exclamations, hyphens, brackets, parentheses, all of them closely linked to what is called orthotypography, which are a set of rules to know how to use these elements properly. And finally, we find ligatures and alternates. Ligatures are sets of letters that come in pairs or groups of three. The typographic designer creates what is known as a ligature to give a more harmonious visual entity. Alternates, on the other hand, are different possibilities that the typeface family offers us regarding specific letters. Another more decorative type of A, another type of E, another type of M, and so on. All this will depend a lot on each family. Here, for example, we have a sentence with placeholder text in two fonts. If we go to InDesign and I select this first font, we see the little symbol here at the bottom of OpenType. OpenType is a very recent programming system, the most modern, that manages to gather an infinite number of possibilities within each typeface family. What happens? Not all typefaces are made with OpenType. If I, in this first case where the typography is Adobe Caslon Pro, click on the OpenType option, I will get the option to transform the entire typography, that is this text, into small caps, which means small capitals. I could do it with just one click. If I want to activate the OpenType options of this typeface, I should go to Within Character to the little hamburger, and here we have the OpenType options. As you can see, the All Small Caps option is checked so that it shows up when I click on the on-screen text. But I could select different options, for example here, the ligatures we were talking about. If I select this pair of letters, FL, I see the OpenType symbol, I click it, and I will get the option to make a ligature here. If I move to the next font, which is an accident grotesque, notice that when I click on the OpenType option, it tells me that the OpenType properties are not applicable in this case. So with this font, we couldn't play as much. In any case, each typeface comes with a lot of glyphs that we can use. Notice that I'm inside this typeface. I go to glyphs, and within glyphs, I will tell it that I want to see the entire typeface. So this way, I see all the glyphs that come with this typeface here. If you haven't displayed in your floating windows the glyphs and the character we saw earlier, you need to go to Window, Types and Tables, and here we see Character, and also the glyph option. Now we move on to the characteristics of the letter. The first and most evident characteristic is going to be the stroke. The stroke will have a direct relationship with the ductus, that is, with the tool intended to have created this typography. The next characteristic of the letter would be the axis. The axis of a typeface is mainly marked by circular letters like O or G, and is obtained by connecting the thinnest points of those letters with a line. The O, which is the easiest letter to figure out that axis, we see that in this case it has an inclination that will be around 6 to 8 degrees. This inclination of the axis tells us a bit about a humanistic reminiscence. Of course, we have seen many other typefaces where the axis is completely vertical. Another characteristic would be the contrast. Contrast is very important and tells us about the difference between thin and thick within the stroke of the letters of a typography. In this case, we see it marked with circles, and we can see the difference between the sizes of those circles. The greater the difference in the size of the circles, the more we talk about higher contrast. In this case, since the typography is sans serif, even though there is slight modulation, we see how the contrast is much lower. In many sans serif fonts, there is even no contrast. The stroke is consistent throughout the entire typeface. Here, finally, we see another example where the contrast is even greater. Let's now talk about styles and families. The main styles we will find in a typeface will be the regular style, the bold style, and the italic styles. Within the styles of families, we can also find intermediate weights, such as medium or the semi-bold, and we can even find a new style called display, which is a special version designed for use in large sizes, such as titles or headings. The display styles of a family have some specific adjustments, such as finer and more elegant details, as they are expected to be seen in a large size, a greater contrast between thick and thin strokes, curves or endings that are slightly more ornate or stylized, and sometimes even a slightly taller X height different. In any case, we have to keep in mind that new fonts are increasingly playing with the concept of superfamily thanks to these new programming languages we were discussing. Technology evolves, and thus fonts and typographers can do many more things. Here, for example, we see a superfamily of the typeface called sharp, where we move from a thin to a black, passing through light, book, medium, semi-bold, and bold. All that if we talk about the weight of the stroke. And then, if we move down, what we're doing is widening each of the letters more and more, going from a very condensed typeface, 0.5, to a very expanded or extended one, which would be 25. And finally, we are going to finish the anatomy of the type by talking about spacing, specifically the difference in concepts between tracking and kerning. If we start with tracking, let's say that tracking is the distance between each of the letters in a word. If we decrease the tracking, we will bring the letters of a word closer together. If we increase the tracking, we will separate the letters of a word. Here we would see it represented with this word and how it would change if we reduce the tracking until those letters touch each other. What often happens is that between some pairs of letters, very large spaces are generated in the counterform. In this case, we see it between the T and the A, and for this we have the kerning to correct those spaces through fine adjustments. In this image, a negative kerning of -65 has been applied, which has moved the A in yellow to the left into the area of the T in blue, creating that vertical green rectangle, which gives the value of -65. Here in this image, we see the same example where we have placed the cursor between the T and the A, and we see how in the character panel, the kerning has been set to -65, while the tracking is at 0. Normally, we are always going to find this problem between pairs of letters that have diagonal shapes. They are fine adjustments, you have to pay attention, but they truly make the difference if we want to be good editorial designers. Mainly, we will use kerning in large headlines, where this spacing between pairs of letters will be much more noticeable. To summarize, tracking is the general spacing of the typography between each of the letters of each of the words, while kerning is the fine adjustments we make between pairs of letters. Alright, we have reached the end of this class. I hope you enjoyed it a lot and see you in the next video.